Hi, everybody. You're listening to Comics and History, episode number 116, Spotlight on Green Lantern Alan Scott in the Pre-Flashpoint era. And welcome to the show. I am your host, Brian J. Rygate, and class is back in session. And folks, I have been looking so very much forward to recording this episode for a long time now. This is easily going to be a two-parter. I can certainly see it stretching into a third and maybe even a fourth part, depending on how long-winded I get. Because my goodness, do I ever love this particular period in Alan Scott's publishing history, covering the years 1999 through mid-2011, the pre-Flashpoint era. Some might refer to this era as the Jeff Johns era, and that during this period of time, it was Johns who was writing the majority of Alan Scott's appearances through the pages of JSA, as well as events like Infinite Crisis and Blackest Night. But Johns wasn't writing Alan Scott exclusively. There were other writers who included Alan in their stories. And just as in every other period in Alan's publishing history, save for the Golden Age, he did not have his own solo title. And yet in the pre-Flashpoint era, Alan Scott made so many appearances. There's no way that I can cover all of his individual appearances. Broad spoilers, ahoy, for a decade and change's worth of comic stories, but I'm really going to be focusing on key developments in Alan's character, his power set, his status quo. I may not refer to a whole lot of specific issue numbers, although I'm certainly going to be addressing JSA number 50 in some detail later on in this episode. But this was just such a wonderful period which built upon what came in the Golden Age and the Bronze Age, especially for Alan. And I'm not going to go through a whole talk about which of those three periods, Gold and Bronze, pre-Flashpoint, is my favorite period. I'm going to say that all three periods offered something unique. And what was really special about the pre-Flashpoint era is that it really built upon everything that had come before in Alan's history and allowed for further development of the character. So I'm going to be focusing on things like Alan's relationship with characters such as the Flash, Jay Garrick. It's important that I talk about his relationship with his children, especially Obsidian at this time. And of course, I'm going to be talking about that all-important change in Alan's status quo when he took back the title of Green Lantern, which led a lot of fans to yell out, well, it's about darn time, isn't it? So I hope that you all will enjoy listening to this episode as much as I'm enjoying recording it right now. Given my schedule with work and what's coming up with reports and whatnot, I'm going to have to go back to my bi-weekly release schedule. So part 2 will come your way in a couple of weeks. But I'm using whatever time I've got now to record as many episodes, get those in the can as possible. So at the very least, folks, I do want to be releasing new recordings every couple of weeks. Now, when talking about Alan Scott in the pre-Flashpoint era, it's actually important to backtrack a few years to 1993-94 and talk about James Robinson, the much acclaimed writer of such books as the post-Zero Hour Starman. And I honestly forgot that James Robinson's The Golden Age was actually written prior to Zero Hour. I have the trade which was printed in the 2000s, and so it has what was then the modern JSA cover logo on the front. And I just lost sight of the fact that the story was originally published in the first half of the 90s. Now, for those of you who don't know, The Golden Age was originally produced in 4 parts, and it was an Elseworlds story, but Mr. Robinson would later take elements from The Golden Age and incorporate them in his later work on Starman. And then David Goyer and Jeff Johns would also borrow elements from the Golden Age and incorporate them in their writing on the JSA title. So in the Golden Age, you see things like Starman, Ted Knight, leaving the mantle of Starman for a period as he sought help recuperating mentally and emotionally due to his guilt over his involvement in the creation of the atomic bomb, which of course devastated Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In terms of Alan Scott's depiction, Alan was having troubles both in his work life as well as in his superhero career. On the work side, he was the president of the Gotham Broadcasting Station, but thanks to the McCarthy hearings, he found himself among those who were blacklisted. And at the same time, like other Golden Age heroes, Alan was finding himself a bit of a crossroads in terms of his superhero career. And at one point when he was talking with his old JSA buddies, he looked at his Green Lantern ring and he said, I think I want a divorce, meaning that he was looking at moving away from staying on as Green Lantern. Of course, it's not like he could pass his ring on to another person like a member of the Green Lantern Corps could. But in the end, Alan did make an appearance as Green Lantern in the climactic battle. And again, it is an Elseworlds tale, and I won't spoil it for you, but when you get to the last page of the Golden Age, you'll see it and you'll say, oh, of course, this is what makes it an Elseworlds tale. But aside from that last page, it really doesn't feel like an Elseworlds story. It feels more like a story that helps fill in the gaps with JSA history in the post-war years. And it's well worth the read, folks. It's a really beautiful read. And that's why I'm thankfully more towards a more vague description of a couple of elements from this book. So after the Golden Age and after Zero Hour, with Ted Knight being returned to his proper chronological age, David Knight stepped in and took up the mantle of Starman, but he died shortly after that, and so it fell to a newly created character, created by James Robinson, of course, Jack Knight, to take up the mantle of Starman. And this started a celebrated 6-year run on the title. James Robinson's Starman is viewed as one of the finest books of the 1990s. There are any number of readers who would say it's one of the finest ongoing comics titles ever. it was a book which, along with the Golden Age, helped establish James Robinson as a writer who had a real understanding of Golden Age history and a real love for the Golden Age of comics and its characters. And James Robinson has since gone on to do many other things, but people always look back fondly on his run on Starman. So much so that there is an actual agreement between DC and James Robinson that if any other writer wants to use the Jack Knight Starman or any of the other characters that James Robinson created for the Starman end of a DC universe, DC has to seek permission from Mr. Robinson to use the characters. I don't know if there's any money involved, but there's certainly a pretty considerable level of respect as being shown for a writer who did not create the character for a company like Image where he could hang on to the rights to the character. Mr. Robinson didn't create the concept of Starman, but just goes to show that DC really appreciated the work that he did, really building up the Starman legacy over those 6 years. And so that's why you see Jack Knight very little these days, and very often in non-speaking cameos. A notable exception would be Mr. Goyer's and Mr. Johns' work on JSA in the first few issues after Mr. Robinson left JSA. But I think in that case, Mr. Robinson saw that there was a point to having Jack in those books. And so he didn't see any issue with Jack having a significant speaking part in those early issues of JSA after Mr. Robinson left the book. So by 1999, however, Mr. Robinson was looking at wrapping up Starman. He was looking at moving on to different things. And this coincided at a time when the powers that were at DC were more in favor of embracing the company's history and legacy. People like Paul Levitt, Stan DiDio were not opposed to the Golden Age characters coming back and having a role in the DCU, in comparison to how editorial and executives felt in 1994. And as at least one other commenter once wrote online, I wish that I had written down the name somewhere so I could give them proper credit. Volume 1 of JSA really came out of the ashes of James Robinson's Starman. So Starman was used as a sort of a launching point for the JSA title. But more than that, Mr. Robinson was one of the writers on a miniseries titled The Justice Society Returns. And when you hear that title, you would think, oh, okay, so it's a story that's set in the present day, showing the JSAers all returning to the fold. And that actually wasn't it. It was actually a new story, which took place in the mid-1940s. A really good primer for people who knew very little about the JSA, its history, and wanted to learn about the original society before the launch of the new JSA. Also, a really enjoyable miniseries for longtime JSA fans who were also looking forward to reading a new story that showed the JSAers in their prime. And it was a miniseries that was bookended by All-Star Comics 1 and All-Star Comics 2. And then the main body of the story was told over several issues, the titles of which were revived Golden Age comics titles. So, for example, Alan's part of the story took place in All-American Comics #1. Of course, new #1